Sergeant Elias Thorne stood swaying in the spire's doorway, his sword snapped in half and his uniform soaked in a mixture of red and green blood, yet he refused to let the Skarn battalion pass. Behind him, the core breaker hummed with the power to unmake a world, and before him, a sea of obsidian scales waited for a single human to finally die. The math was bad, but the spite was perfect. Why won't he just fall? If you've ever wondered why the smallest spark can sometimes burn the brightest, stick around. We're diving into the moment Sol 3 stopped being a playground and started being a warning. 6 months earlier, the most pressing concern for the Terran Enclave had been the fluctuating price of synthetic protein and the humidity in the lower levels. The Luminari were the masters of the sector, radiant and untouchable, their silver ships patrolling the borders like celestial shepherds. To the humans living in their shadow on Isleguard, they were the babysitters of the galaxy, and we were the primitives they had kindly decided to protect. Thorne remembered the weight of his sidearm back then, tucked into a locker and gathering a fine layer of gray dust. It was a blocky, utilitarian piece of hardware, out of place among the elegant architecture of the spire. At the time, he joked that if a Skarn ever actually made it to the surface, that little pistol wouldn't do much more than provide a very loud way to say goodbye. It was a relic of a more violent history, something the Luminari looked upon with a mixture of pity and academic interest. Then the sky turned the color of bruised plums. The Skarn fleet didn't just arrive. They tore through the Luminari vanguard like silk under a serrated blade. Archon Zyra, usually a vision of composure, watched from the heights as her people's legacy crumbled in hours. The reports coming into the Enclave basement were frantic fragments of static and screams. Commander Vance paced the small, cramped tactical room, her boots clicking a rhythmic, nervous tattoo on the metal floor. Her orders were clear. Neutrality protocols were in effect. Humans were non-combatants, too primitive to be considered a threat or a prize. If they stayed hidden, if they stayed quiet, they might be overlooked in the coming slaughter. Thorne sat on a munitions crate, methodically checking the magazines of his service pistol. 1, 2, 3. Each slide of the metal felt heavy, a grounding mechanical reality against the madness unfolding above. A wet scraping sound echoed from the corridor. A Luminari messenger, his silver robes drenched in violet ichor, collapsed into the room. He spoke of the core breaker, of Zyra's despair, and the suicide switch that would vaporize every soul on Othelgard to deny the Skarn their victory. Vance shook her head, her face a mask of rigid, terrified discipline. She told Thorne to sit down, to let the giants settle their own debts. But Thorne looked at the messenger, then at the dusty pistol in his hand. He realized then that the primitive status the galaxy gave us wasn't a cage, it was a cloak. It meant the Skarn weren't looking for us, and that was their first mistake. Would you risk everything for a world that isn't yours? Let's see how far one man's stubbornness can go. Thorne stood up, the crate creaking under his weight. He didn't look at Vance as he walked toward the heavy blast doors, the blocky silhouette of his sidearm tucked firmly into his belt. The spire's air was thick with the scent of ozone and the copper tang of blood. Elu, a young Luminari scholar who had never held anything heavier than a data scroll, trembled as she helped Thorne barricade the inner sanctum. They had moved with a desperate, frantic speed through the burning streets, gathering a handful of survivors who had been left for dead by the Skarn advance. Thorne didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who had been put through a meat grinder and decided he didn't like the texture. His breathing was a ragged, wet sound in the sudden silence of the throne room. Archon Zyra sat slumped against the pedestal of the core breaker, her silver skin dulled by gray ash. Her fingers hovered over the activation crystal. She looked at Thorne, her large, luminous eyes filled with a hollow kind of grief that surpassed physical pain. She told him to leave, that the planet was already lost, and that there was no dignity in dying for a tomb. Theus pulled the blocky Terran pistol from his belt. The finish was scuffed, and the grip was slick with his own sweat. He ejected the magazine, checked the brass of the remaining rounds, and slammed it back home with a definitive metallic click. "I don't know much about dignity, Archon," he said, his voice grating like gravel, "but I know about holding the door. You want to blow this place up? Fine, but you wait until I'm done. You wait until they have to climb over a mountain of their own dead to reach you." He turned toward the grand archway of the spire. The Skarn were coming. He could hear the rhythmic clatter of their obsidian boots and the guttural hissing of their war chants. The defense was not a graceful affair. It was a primal, ugly display of human endurance. Thorn used the spire's narrow entryway as a choke point, his pistol barking in the confined space until the slide locked back on an empty chamber. When the ammunition ran dry, he didn't retreat. He used the heavy metal frame of the gun as a blunt force club, shattering the triangular snouts of the Skarn who tried to rush him. He took hits. A serrated blade caught his shoulder. A kinetic pulse bruised his ribs. But every time a Skarn warrior thought the human was finished, Thorn took another step forward. He was a glitch in their calculated conquest, a variable that refused to be solved. The math was bad, but the spite was perfect. And then the bridge back to the moment of the drop. Standing in that doorway, swaying with exhaustion and loss of blood, Thorn saw the battalion pause. They saw a creature that should have died 10 minutes ago, still standing, still snarling, holding a broken sword and a battered piece of Terran steel. Behind him, Zyra's hand had moved away from the crystal. She wasn't looking at the end of her world anymore. She was looking at the beginning of a legend. The silence was broken not by a Skarn war cry, but by the roar of a Terran shuttle's engines. Commander Vance had ignored the protocols. She had seen the feed from Thorn's suit cam and decided that neutrality was a coward's lie. The Skarn hegemon, Krell, watched from his command ship as the primitive humans began to rain fire from the clouds. Seeing the unnatural ferocity of the lone soldier in the doorway and the reinforcements screaming in, the Skarn made their first tactical retreat in a century. Weeks later, in the quiet aftermath, Zyra visited the recovery ward. Thorn's pistol sat on the bedside table, its metal scarred and its firing pin broken, no longer a weapon but a relic of a soul debt that could never be repaid. She touched the cold steel, marveling at how something so small had held back an empire. The galaxy had always looked at Sol 3 and seen a nursery. Now they looked and saw a forge. The empty, battered pistol sat in the light of Ethelgard's twin sons, a silent testament to the day the babysitters were saved by the children. What would you be willing to stand for when everyone else tells you to run? We'll be right here waiting for your answer when the next story breaks.